What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Venom run, which you guys really seem to enjoy. And indeed, the Venom run's really good. But here's the funny thing. In this one, apparently we're starting a new story arc. I didn't realize the first one was only 2 issues, which is kind of cool. But basically, we're switching over to, in a lot of ways, the story of Dylan, right? So we don't really see much of Eddie Brock in this. Instead, what we do is we switch over to the headquarters of the reformed Life Foundation. Now, for those of you guys who don't know who the Life Foundation is or need a bit of a refresher, because we've talked about them before. The Life Foundation, in all honesty, their purpose kind of seems to be evolving, right? Because when they originally appeared back in Lethal Protector, the nature of the Life Foundation is that they were kind of an aftermath to the Cold War. And basically this idea was that humanity would ultimately destroy itself. And indeed, that was the actual concern, right? I never personally lived through the Cold War. I mean, I guess I did. I was born in 1984, but I wasn't old enough to understand what was going on. But anybody who lived through the Cold War, talking to my grandparents and so on and so forth, that the biggest fear was that an actual nuclear war would take place between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's why the Cold War is referred to as the Cold War, because the United States and Russia didn't actually go to war with each other. It was the Soviet Union backing governments and basically trying to implement communism in different countries, while the United States was trying to implement capitalism in different countries. So it was as much an economic war as it was a war between various nations, each one fighting on behalf of either the Soviet Union or the United States. But the nature of the Life Foundation is they believe that because of the Cold War, somewhere along the line, something would happen and either the United States or the Soviet Union would press the button. Missiles would go flying and that would be the end of everything. And so what they did is they built this giant bunker, but in order to make sure that once everything evolved, like once everything kind of settled down and that really it's an antiquated concept, but the idea of nuclear winter basically came to an end, that they could ascend to the surface and basically rule the world. But in order to ensure that the world was ruled under their guidance, right, and there weren't really any kind of competing forces out there, they basically created different symbiotes based off the Venom symbiote. And that's where you got like Phage and Scream and different characters like that from back in the day. And so the funny thing is that where Carlton Drake, the old man here, was the guy who led the group originally, while they were based in the Cold War, obviously, as we know, the Cold War didn't end the way that you expected it to. And so in a lot of ways, the question to ask here is, what purpose does the Life Foundation serve anymore? And it's probably just the idea that, like, because of the development of the nuclear age and because of the fact that nuclear weapons still exist and humanity just can't get itself together, at some point along the line, something will happen, things will pop off. And this fear that was rooted in the Cold War of the world ending through some kind of armed conflict, that it's still there, right? It still reigns. But one of the cool things about this is that Carlton Drake was always very intrigued by the symbiotes, even if his intrigue led him to viewing them as a kind of protectionary force or a weapon that could be used for the Life Foundation's own ends. When he's talking to Carson, basically this guy who led the forces to initially face off against Venom, where they're all talking and Carlton Drake is basically running over a lot of what we know, right? The symbiotes originated from space somewhere, and then we found out they originated from Knull, and basically all the information that we've gained over the years from the time that Venom first appeared in Marvel Comics, running all the way up to the Life Foundation and a lot of the stories that have taken place since then, that what he says is, for all the things we've learned, we still don't really know anything. The only thing we know is that every time we try to defeat a symbiote using sonics or fire or what have you, they find some way to evolve. Whether it's because they bond themselves to Spider-Man or they bond themselves to someone like Eddie Brock or whatever the case is, that they're evolved from a god. At the end of the day, humanity just doesn't really seem to have the ability to overcome them. And that's when he kind of chimes in and says the biggest issue that held the Life Foundation back in understanding the nature of the symbiotes, that humanity defines things by its function. And when Carson asks, like, what do you I don't understand, like, what are you talking about? He uses the example of an umbrella. And he's like, what's the purpose of an umbrella? And the response of Carson is to say, well, to keep the rain from getting on you. And the answer of Carlton Drake is yes. But say that we punched a hole in it and rain came through the umbrella. At that point, does it cease to be an umbrella? Does it stop being one? Or is it simply just an umbrella with holes in it? But if we define an umbrella by its function, which is to keep the rain from getting on us, but it's no longer able to do that, then what is it now? And that's what's so interesting, is because he sees the symbiotes as kind of this reflection of evolution. And that was always the way the Life Foundation saw symbiotes, as kind of this evolutionary imperative, not insofar as it was the next stage of humanity, but insofar as they could use the technology of the symbiotes or the nature of the symbiotes to improve humanity as a whole. And so that's when he's kind of like, the one thing that we need here more than anything else, we need to poke holes in these symbiotes, right? We need to figure the limits of their ability to adapt, the limits of their ability to evolve. At what point can we reach some level of weaponry to where when we face face off against the symbiote, there's nothing it can do to stop us, right? There's nothing it can do to overcome us, that we can completely and totally overwhelm these things. And so at that point, you actually switch over to the Venom symbiote itself. Now remember, the Venom symbiote is absent of Dylan at the moment, and it's kind of out there doing its own thing, sort of hanging around. I mean, it hasn't really abandoned Dylan, but it sort of discusses its own existence, and to a degree, even laments its own existence, right? And simply saying that over the course of the time since it was created until the modern day, it served a lot of different purposes. During the Kree-Skrull War, it was bonded to Telkar, and it was really this kind of embodiment of like death and destruction, right? Everywhere the Venom symbiote went, death was sure to follow, and people actually became fearful of it. It was created by Knull, different things along those lines, and the time that Eddie and the Venom symbiote spent together when they first appeared in Marvel Comics, that they were this just kind of overwhelming force that not even Spider-Man could stand against, right? That it sees itself as this being that hails from this life and this kind of history of violence and destruction, right? It was a thing to be feared. And now it looks at its existence and it's like, I'm a dog, right? Like I'm a companion that follows Dylan. And it's not really meant to be humorous, even though it is to a degree. It's one of these things where the Venom symbiote sees itself as having fallen from grace so incredibly far. And the way that it relates to this is it talks about this idea that it's considered leaving Dylan, right? Like abandoning Dylan entirely and going off and doing its own thing. Presumably, even if it has the possibility, cutting itself off from the hive mind of Eddie Brock. So not even Eddie Brock will be able to detect this thing, assuming Eddie's even still alive. Because if you guys recall in the last video, it looked like Eddie Brock was dead. And so because of this, the thing that always brings the symbiote back is it seems to have these memories of its time with Eddie, and because of the emotional involvement with the two of them, it seems to have a kind of loyalty to Dylan, right? If only for the life that the Venom symbiote and Eddie spent together, that it's almost like it owes it to Dylan in order to make sure that Dylan stays safe. Now, at that point, we switch over to Archer Lyle and Dylan himself. Now, Archer Lyle, again, is a very new character. She appeared in the last issue of Venom, right? So she's a brand new introduction here, but she's also what you would call like an investigative reporter to a degree, in the sense that when she's talking to Dylan, she talks about her involvement with Eddie Brock and saying that, like, you know, the two of them worked together when Eddie was like a young reporter trying to make his bones, right? And trying to get himself out there, trying to get that big scoop, right? That Pulitzer Prize winning scoop, so he could make a name for himself among all these different journalists out there. What he was initially going on for was something called the Lost Gold Scandal, but as time went on and he began to make a name for himself, he basically disappeared, right, from Archer Lyle's life, just vanished. She never really heard from him for years, until suddenly he popped up and he said, I am basically going to die here in a little while, and the group behind my death is basically the Absent Throne. Now, here's the cool thing about this. This is what I love about the idea of the Absent Throne. This reminds me of Project Wide Awake in so many ways. And those of you guys who are old enough to remember the old X-Men comics, right, who have read through like Chris Claremont's run or anything like that, the way the Absent Throne is pitched here is that there's some kind of clandestine, shady organization that has financial ties and political involvement with everyone, right? So they're backing like the Friends of Humanity, they were backing the Life Foundation, all that stuff. And that when you follow the money, which is always what you do whenever you're trying to track down some crony corporation, you always follow the trail of money, that it would lead to like shell companies on top of shell companies on top of shell companies. A great amount of effort was taken to keep themselves hidden away from the world. And the reason why this reminds me of Project Wide Awake is that's how Project Wide Awake operated, right? I mean, like you go and you read the old Chris Claremont X-Men comics, Project Wide Awake, as we've talked about before, was a government-based organization, but everyone was involved in this, right? Like they had ties to corporations, right? They had ties to like local police officers, right? State sheriff's office, the FBI, the assistant to the national security advisor, the president's personal assistant, like everybody was involved in this, right? This just massive anti-mutant crackdown to contain and control the mutant threat. So it's always really interesting to see how things like Chris Claremont's X-Men and like Project Wide Awake, and even a lot of the shady organizations that came before Project Wide Awake still kind of repeat themselves, but in different capacities. But through her investigations and her poking around, Archer Lyle ended up finding what appeared to be a small research facility out in Plymouth. And so her stance is like, we're gonna go there, or at least I'm gonna go there, I'm gonna investigate, right, hack their computers, whatever I need to do, get as much information as I can to add to this existing information to see if I can't figure out what's going on with the Absent Throne. Now, initially, Dylan tries to tag along, and where her response is, I mean, no, like, I don't want you there, he's pretty adamant about it, right? Dylan kind of trying to prove himself and show what he's capable of. And so the response of Archer is, okay, fine, you can come along, but you cannot bring the Venom symbiote because you've demonstrated that whenever you get angry, you kind of quote unquote Hulk out when it comes to the symbiote. You can't quite control yourself. And that's always been the biggest issue of Dylan Dylan, right? Whenever Dylan had the Venom symbiote, he would always sort of lose control because he's young, because he's impulsive and highly emotional, right? He's just at that age where like hormones govern his life, that his ability to control the symbiote and to be methodical doesn't really seem to exist. And so if he were to bring the symbiote with him, it would basically lead to a most likely situation where his emotions would get the better of him and the symbiote would just go plowing through the entire facility. And if this whole thing is supposed to be a super secret investigation, right, espionage, you don't go in guns blazing, right? Like you sneak in. So you can't really trust the symbiote or even Dylan with the symbiote in that capacity. But the response of Dylan is, well, I'm not going unarmed, right? So he ultimately ends up bringing Sleeper, the symbiote that's more of like a spy symbiote. He ends up bringing that with him. And then of course, the main Venom symbiote ends up staying behind. Now, as they get to Exodynamics, which is this material research facility, the one they've been investigating in Plymouth, of course, Archer's able to get in there, but with the help of Sleeper, Dylan gets in there more effectively than she does, right? So obviously proving himself. But once they get into this room with all these computer systems, right? All these systems they can hack, they can gain information from, and so on, Dylan's led into a room and the door shuts behind him. And that's when you find out the whole thing was a trap, that somewhere along the line in her investigations, the Absent Throne found out Lyle was looking into them. And as you would expect with any kind of shady organization like this, no risks are taken, right? There's no real risk taken here. And so what they end up doing is basically brokering a deal and saying, never look into us again, or next time we'll just kill you. But like, we will let you go, but give us Dylan in your place. And she did, right? She basically set him up, like she set up Dylan. And so once these forces of what's essentially Alchemax come pouring in here, that basically they incapacitate Dylan with tranquilizer darts, and then they incapacitate Sleeper using sonics. And with these two taken out, then you get into the introduction of Liz Allen. And this is pretty rough, right? Because remember, Liz Allen is tied in with like Harry Osborn. You go and you read the Spider-Man comics, she seems like what, you know, a little bit shady, but like one of the nicer people out there. In this, she's cold-hearted. And that's the nature of Liz Allen, right? As the leader of Alchemax, she's got two different faces. Well, she's got more than two faces, but you see largely two different sides of her, right? You see the cold, methodical, like whether Dylan knows it or not, right? He's right in the middle of what's basically a symbiote arms race. But then you see like the Spider-Man version of her where she's a little kinder and a little gentler and kids and different things like that, right? So putting on those two different fronts. But this first and foremost is what's really going on here. And it was the expected outcome. Knull shows up on Earth and like attacks humanity, almost conquers the world. And where most people out there are just fleeing for their lives and superheroes are trying to save the general public and trying to stop this threat, people who are weapons manufacturers, major corporations, they're looking at this whole thing unfolding and they're asking the question, how can we find a way to make money off this? That it really is a symbiote arms race. Tony Stark was not the only person to think of bonding symbiote technology with his own technology. Not the only person to think of that. And he wasn't the last, right? Alchemax was thinking of it. The Life Foundation was thinking of it. And presumably the Friends of Humanity were working on something like that, right? Because they're not just a bunch of ragtag crazy guys who are just ranting in the streets about hating mutants. The Friends of Humanity is highly organized. They've come a long way since the days of Graydon Creed, right? The Friends of Humanity are a wholly different beast now. And so ultimately, where you switch back over to Carlton Drake and Carson, the response of Carson is, okay, like I get what you're saying, and this is really, really fascinating. Here's my question. How do you suggest we poke holes in a symbiote, right? How do you suggest we hunt down these symbiotes, we attack these symbiotes, we find some way to overcome them, right? Because they seem pretty capable to me. And what you end up finding out here is that the Life Foundation has actually been working on a powered suit that will serve the purpose of essentially allowing them to overcome symbiotes. More so than that, looking at the nature of this suit, it looks like it's not just designed to be Earth-based. It looks like it could actually work in the vacuum of space. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. I'm really intrigued to see what direction this goes in. I'm really looking forward to it. But anyway, guys, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.